Hey guys, what is up? Welcome to Oversimplified Part 2. This should be very interesting indeed. We're going to see the final part of World War II, and then the, sorry, and then the Napoleonic era.
So what else is happening? Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true. Many Commonwealth nations and other Allied colonies had joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaign. War in Britain support. They would play a key role throughout.
I've never seen that before, and I've seen this whole video like maybe 3 times. I never noticed. There's always like small details you can see in Oversimplified.
The war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union...
Yeah, but behind the scenes, they weren't the best of friends. Like, for example, Germany had placed the Aryan race on top, and in the Mediterranean's like, I think, number 3 or number 4 on the list of the most important races, which made Mussolini a little angry. So there was some tension there. And then Japan was really far, so their culture was very different, which probably also made it a little bit, hard to always be friends. They weren't really allies due to, like, the nationality and culture. I think it was more just they knew that if they didn't team up, they would lose, which they did still lose. But the three of them kind of saw it as, what are we supposed to do? There isn't that many fascist nations. We gotta use what we can, right? So the shared idea of fascism and trying to take over everything. That's kind of the idea they were going for.
Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a
The Winter War.
Humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace.
Yeah, that was so embarrassing. Like, Finland held out so well against Russia, but they still lost.
Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine, so he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly.
In Hearts of Iron 4, I actually played in Ethiopia. I got absolutely wiped out. What was the other one?
Well, then he tried to take
Oh, and this, it went like mid. I have no clue.
Egypt, and that went less well. Then
it looked exactly like that.
he tried to take Greece, and that went...
I'm the complete opposite. So, like, in the middle part, yeah, and the second thing Mussolini attempted, I did less well. But in this, I absolutely destroyed Greece. They had a few islands right here, but I absolutely got destroyed in Ethiopia. I lost everything.
Really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly.
Well, 2 victories, even one that didn't do so well. I don't think that's that bad. But the whole Albania and Greece, I can understand.
He began favoring a military campaign from the south and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the tripartite pact and joining the Axis powers.
Hungary was kind of semi-fascist, so it makes sense that they would join.
Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The tripartite pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won.
It was a little more complicated than that. I think the main thing was he was very popular after the Great Depression, but it wasn't just hooray, There was a lot of other things that went on.
Churchill asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston, but you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships in the Atlantic.
The Germans, I'll give them this. They know how to technologically advance. They know how to engineer. They're very, very clever people. They just use so much of it for evil.
Including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology.
Just wish he mentioned the Bismarck. The Bismarck was so cool. Next video, I'm going to react to the Bismarck. Maybe on extra history.
To fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics. At one point, a man even called a meeting and said, "Pykrete. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room.
I might search that up later. I don't really believe it that much.
Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa, Britain decided to push Italy out of Egypt. Hey,
that's what happened to me.
That was pretty easy, so they kept going.
That's actually what happened to me also.
Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded.
When I played, Yugoslavia became a puppet state of Italy and joined. I think we fought France. If I remember, we fought France and we fought the Soviet Union because they both became communist. And we still lost. It's so crazy.
Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion. The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt, and they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out!
That was the dumbest move Hitler could have made. He should have focused on getting more victories against the Allies. And if I were, go back.
East, the British didn't seem like any real threat.
Okay, so one, build massive defenses here. And I still think that Stalin would not invade. Not like maybe after a year or two, I think he probably would have invaded out of, fear. But I don't think he would have invaded if they have successfully got Britain to surrender. I think all they needed to do was focus on Britain, cut them off, keep taking away their supply lines, starve them out, do that. And then while doing that, get Italy and see if they can take advantage of a weakened Britain. Once you do that, take out Free France, and then invade the Soviet Union. That's what I would have done. I feel like that would be much smarter to do, but he refused. I also would have tried to get Spain involved, because remember, that was nationalist Spain. They were a fascist country. If they would have gotten nationalist Spain involved, I think that would have changed a lot, seeing how they would have such a powerful sphere of influence in the Iberian Peninsula. And if they take out Portugal, who is an ally of the Allies, well, let's just say that would not help them out in this area.
For now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out! With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history, and Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had warned him.
See, he was far from ready, but he also still probably wouldn't have invaded Germany because out of trust, right? He still thought that they can diplomatically solve their problems. He was focused on, not being so diplomatic in his own country, however.
Of an impending attack, but he dug his head in the sand and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops. 250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal.
Imagine he never invaded. Imagine if Stalin didn't invade Finland. That was actually a good call to invade Finland and, fix up the borders, because then they would have been closer, and I think possibly they might have taken Leningrad. Who knows?
From the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War, the ethnic peoples...
That is such a large amount of land. Look at this. This is so massive. This is bigger than Germany. All the land that Germany got, that's nothing compared to this. Like, that's so big. This is all, almost all the land that he was able to get on his team. Like, that's just crazy. No one can comprehend how large this is. Like, I'm pretty sure all this land alone would make, like, maybe, it would probably be worth, like, 6 or 7 U.S. states, right? I feel like that's how big it would be. Literally, this is worth, like, 4 Texases. 5.
There was now unleashed in all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it. The Germans were now inside of Moscow, and that's it. It's all over. But then,
I don't think they would have given up, even if Moscow was lost. I still think they would keep on fighting. And the land even farther out they couldn't conquer. I think they just needed to push far enough where they can take away the factories and also take away the Caucasus so they can get all the oil, which would have helped them out even better.
it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No, keep going. But oil is literally freezing inside our vehicles." "That's fine. Keep going. We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift." "Perfectly normal. Keep going."
Yeah, that was insanely stupid of Hitler. I heard a story where apparently it got so bad at one point that they ate their own horses. Think about that.
Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then, Stalin called in troops from the Siberian front, specially trained to fight in the extreme cold, and the Germans were no match. They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill, but they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence and getting those sweet, sweet raw materials. They began making plans to expand southward, but there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest?
It's a smart idea, but it still would have never worked. America's way too powerful.
And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also attacked British colonies in Southeast Asia. Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on...
Yeah, but with declaring war, I think like he was obligated to do that in the Tripartite Pact. I think he had to. I'm not too sure. Can you tell me in the comments below, did he have to declare war, or was that more optional?
on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon.
Bruh, if they would have fully destroyed Pearl Harbor, think about how much the world would change.
In the meantime,
Maybe not that much, but it probably would have been longer delayed for America to beat Japan.
the Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia and the borders of India. Japan's victory had been as staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories...
Think about that. From Japan all the way to Australia. Threatening Australia. Threatening Australia. Do you know how much land they had to go through? Or like not land, but just like how the far distance of that. That's just crazy.
had been based on speed, not power, and power would eventually catch up with them.
Exactly.
For now, though, in all occupied nations, the people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take all the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler...
Soon you'll see, probably in my opinion, the biggest battle of all time. Because if this battle was a win for Hitler, this would have changed all of history. They would have conquered the Soviet Union, and I think that probably would have done everything. They probably would have won. I, I don't see the Soviet Union winning if they lose all the Caucasus, if they lose all their oil. They would probably take Moscow and they would be pushed all the way back to Siberia.
Got cocky. He rerouted the 4th Panzer Army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city.
Imagine living in Stalingrad and seeing all of this. That's just insane.
Which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft, and
What?
the Soviets had...
You don't just move all your factories, right? Like, you had all this stuff right here, right? And then he was able to get a whole new factoring system here. My question is, how does he do that? How do you... Is this even good land? Is this land even that good? I mean, Moscow, I believe, would be right around here, right? Moscow's around here. So this goes way deep into Russia. I don't know if the factories would be that good. Or, I don't know. But that's just insane to me. How even when they lost all that land, they were still able to win and still be able to have more resources than Germany, or at least just more manufacturing.
moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready. Stalin gathered his new and improved forces around the city, and in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. Hitler's commanders came to him and said, "Hey, maybe we should retreat." But Hitler said, "No, you stay."
Idiot.
The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe. Things also weren't looking too good for Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over German cities reached devastating levels. In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan was also already seeing its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the US Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually, they sank a lot of them. It was a battle from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. British, Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began...
So, yeah, they were now starting to lose. Everything was just being lost. It's just crazy. What year is this right now? I think it's like early 1944.
to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. "All right," said the Americans, "we'll do it your way." Allied forces successfully landed in Sicily and began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power. Italy immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. "All right," said the Americans, "let's do it our way as well." Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super...
Yeah, he made a lot of enemies, and his friends weren't that strong. Japan was being absolutely destroyed. Italy was already gone. There's a catastrophe with everything. Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, like those three, they're fine, but they're not strong enough. He needed Spain. I feel like Spain would have really helped them out, and they should have done a lot better within 1942. Like after 1942, even 1943, I feel like that's kind of debatable whether he could have won. I think 1942 was the probably the best year he could have done. That was probably the year where he should have won this war. But yeah, that's just my take though.
Super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land. Thanks to Allied deception tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion that had been long in the making was just about ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombs.
Yeah, but like there was like 10 beaches. All kinds of different ones. It wasn't just Normandy.
Bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came. As
Enlisted is the free, brand new online World War II shooter. Command a squad of soldiers and participate in legendary battle.
Allied ships fired a huge number of shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans moved south to capture Brittany. Then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France as the Allied...
As soon as they lost France, I would have surrendered. I would have accepted it. It should have been over by then.
...entered Belgium. In the Far East, the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought landing on fiercely defended small islands as they moved steadily towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese believed that the greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result,
I must not surrender! They're gonna get me? No!
they fought ferociously to the very end, and the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became. In February 1945, the Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense firebombing campaign of Japan's wooden cities began. The Allies suffered some...
It's crazy, because there was a city called Tokyo, which had huge amounts of bombings. The reason they didn't bomb Tokyo, and they only went for Hiroshima and Nagasaki was, I think, one, population. I think since Tokyo was so heavily populated, they didn't want to make too much death, but they needed the cities to be popular enough, right? They have to be, a good mix. So Nagasaki and Hiroshima were the perfect two, right? They didn't want to devastate Japan too far, but they wanted to have severe punishments on them. That's just my well, I feel like would be the reason. I don't know 100% for sure why those and not Tokyo, but I feel like that would be the logical thing to make.
setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial heartland of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate. He said, "We need to turn this thing around, and I've just the trick." Remember a few years back when we blitzkrieged
You're seriously doing that? You seriously want to fight again?
through the Ardennes and trapped the Allied forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Again. He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying, "Surrender or be annihilated." When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces.
1945 End Siege. In Hearts of Iron 4, there's a thing called the End Siege. I wonder, like, I'm just actually wondering, what would happen if, or, no, I'm just saying, how do you win this? Look at this. You're surrounded by millions and millions of troops all around you, with almost no resources left. How do you win? How do you win? You can't. Shockingly, there was actually someone who won this in Hearts of Iron 4. Now, Hearts of Iron 4 can't really do this in real life, right? Because, that's AI versus real generals, but you get my point.
The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing
Yeah, bam. Berlin, as soon as they got Berlin, it's already over. That's when he shot himself, right?
to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin fell, and with it, Hitler's dreams of a great German empire. 2 of the Axis nations had been knocked out. 1 to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island before they would reach the Japanese mainland. The desperate Japanese fought hard, launching kamikaze attacks on the US ships. The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the terrible fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering now. In July, the first successful atomic bomb test took place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapon was ready for use. America and the UK were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki. The cities were reduced to rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible fate. But for the Allies, it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender, saying the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed. Germany was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union.
That's just crazy. Wow. All that. World War II. There you go. That was what led to almost 80 million deaths. How? How do you get so much blood spilled? That's just insane to me. No one realizes this. Well, probably many, but a lot of people don't really put much effort into thinking about this. 80 million, like, wow. That's more than the entire population of France. That's the entire population of Germany. That's Germany. Imagine if every single German died today. Imagine that. Wow.
1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive.
Even if we're going by 50 million, that's still so much death. That's still more, like, that's still the population of France. That's still insane. Like, wow. This actually makes me feel really sad that we fought a war with that much blood. 50 to 80 million. Wow.
Than the first. In its aftermath, 2 major superpowers with 2 very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the 2 of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one.
Funny. So funny of a pun. So yeah, that's kind of the end. Thank you so much for watching this video. And yeah, I think I'm gonna go and just chill now. And I'll see you later. Goodbye.